Hey everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me and welcome to another episode of Glam Metal Gems number 8. So this is where we take a deeper look into the genre itself, at bands and albums that slipped through the crack, flew under the radar, that sort of thing, just didn't get enough love and attention back in the day. Hopefully, shining a light on some of these lost gems here and exposing them to a wider audience, you guys out there. I've got 5 of these to run through here, but before we get started, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like, all those things do help support my channel. And of course, if you turn on notifications, you're going to stay up to date on really cool episodes just like this with Glam Metal Gems. So there's no particular order other than the fact that I like to do these by year when they come out. So this isn't really a countdown or anything like that because all of these are really good in my opinion. First one up here, Baton Rouge, Shake Your Soul from 1990. There's the back side of that. This came out on Atlantic Records. It was their debut studio album produced by Jack Ponte. If you're not familiar with him, I really like him as a producer. For me, he's like another Desmond Child. His production style and his songwriting style, full of melody and very catchy, and it's just one of those things that everything that Jack Ponte touched, I like. So if you're not familiar with him, I highly recommend checking him out and looking at the different bands that he worked with and stuff. And you might agree, you might find that you like his stuff too. So now, when I find a release by Jack Ponte, I pick it up. And just take a quick side note look, Noodle is in the camera. A lot of you guys been asking about him and he doesn't always come out, but there he is making a little mini appearance. All right, back to Baton Rouge and Glam Metal Gems because that's really what we're here for. So vocalist for Baton Rouge is Kelly Keeling, who's done quite a bit out there. So even if you don't know this band, you probably know who he is. He has sung with the Michael Schenker group, MSG. He was in Blue Murder, King Cobra, sung for George Lynch, of course, coming from Dokken, John Norum from Europe on some of his solo releases, and most recently, he's been a member of Trans-Siberian Orchestra, so the guy is definitely out there keeping busy. He's also had a couple solo releases and things like that, so definitely been around the block. But this is where he got his start. This album here, really good. First track, Doctor, was a, quote, hit off of it. I kind of say that with tongue in cheek because we know none of this stuff exploded, but in terms of what came out for these guys, the one that I knew that was all over the radio was the song Walks Like a Woman, and that one was everywhere, at least where I was growing up and the Tampa Bay area down in Florida. That one was big, so when I searched this group out, that's what I was checking out at that point. Now the band would go on to release another one on Atlantic Record, Lights Out on the Playground in 1991, another really good album, highly recommended. This one here had the song Desperate, which was also done by Babylon AD. I talked about it last week in that episode of Glam Metal Gems. But this one here, just a number of other good ones. The Price of Love was the other big one off of that. And in 1997, one more album would come out. I think this one might have only featured Kelly Keeling. They had recently, around maybe 2012, give or take, they were supposed to have put out an album, I believe by Frontier Records and everything, reforming all of that, but nothing ever came of it, unfortunately. So right now, just these 3 albums, but I highly recommend starting with Shake Your Soul. All right, next one up, Cold Sweat, Breakout from 1990. Debut studio album, and at this point, so far, the only one. There's the backside, just so you can see it. And it's a little hard to tell maybe, but there's the guys on the cover there. This one was notable for featuring Mark Ferrari from Keel. Right, remember these guys here, right? So guitar player Mark Ferrari from Keel going out and doing this after the band broke up in 1989. He forms Cold Sweat and puts out this one and only album here. Now the band was also notable because it was the original band, or the original vocalist was going to feature Ani Logan, but he left before recording the debut album here, and of course would go on to front Lynch Mob. But they would eventually feature vocalist Rory Cathy in the lineup, and while maybe not as familiar name as Ani Logan from Lynch Mob. He did do a few other things. He was in a band called The Fifth, most recently Steel City. He's also done some solo work with Mark Ferrari. The one sort of hit that came off of this album here was Crying Shame. Got some radio airplay. I actually found out about this band after the fact, so I didn't know about them back in the day. They weren't getting radio play and MTV play around where I was, at least, but ultimately, me being a Keel fan, dug into stuff and found this, and I highly recommend it. All right, next one up, really like this one here. Company of Wolves, self-titled release from 1990. There's the backside of it. Like this one here, came out on Mercury Records. The album was produced by Jeff Glicksman, and if that name sounds familiar, he's notable for having worked with Kansas. And while Kansas being a prog rock group, in the late 80s and early 90s, he did a lot with glam metal bands and stuff, completely different genre and everything, but a solid producer in his own right, so basically anything he touched was always good. The band is notable for featuring Steve Conte on guitar, who worked with Billy Squier, the New York Dolls, and currently with Michael Monroe. He's right there on the cover. But he's done, I don't know, 4 or 5 albums with Michael Monroe. So definitely out there kicking around, New York-based band and artist and stuff like that. The band itself, the big hit off of this one, at least for me, that I was aware of, and again, we're talking about location, right? Some songs would break in certain areas and be big hits while not doing anything anywhere else. And so I always talk about it in terms of radio hits because it's the stuff that I know. The one that came off of this for me was Hanging by a Thread. Great track. If you don't know it, check it out. It's one of those ones that you might hear and then go, oh yeah, I remember that one on the radio. That's what happened to me for this. Recognized the band name, picked it up, didn't think I knew anything by it. And when that song came on, I was like, oh yeah, so glad that I picked this up because it was such a good tune on the radio. And the band would release 2 more albums for a total of 3, Shakers and Tumblers and Sterile Spy Case. Is he right? Get that right? Yeah, it's a weird name. But yeah, those two albums there. So in all, Company of Wolves has had 3 releases out there. And of course, as I mentioned, Steve Conte doing a number of different things. So you can definitely check him out and what he's done since the days of Company of Wolves. All right, next one up, Cry Wolf Crunch from 1990's second studio album from the band. Although when this one came out, for me, this was what I thought was the debut, and I didn't find out that it was the second album until years later, follow-up to a self-titled only release or when I say only release, self-titled release that only came out in Japan in 1989. And some of the songs that were on that debut album would later turn up on here. I think that's why they both didn't get released in totality, and we've never seen that debut one get re-released because it's really just a regurgitation into what became Crunch. Crunch being, I think, a far better release in my opinion. This one here featuring a couple radio hits that I was aware of. Face Down in the Wishing Well, which is a cool track, and the other one that I really liked was the song called Pretender. Both just really classic, good, straight-up rock and roll songs from that era. And so the band would actually reunite for a third album called 2010, which incidentally came out in 2010. And to date, it is their last album, so making a total of 3 releases for this band. But this one here, IRS Records, I do recommend. Very cool release. Okay, and the last one that we're going to talk about here is one you guys probably know, but I still like to shine a light on some of these bands that are a little more well-known than some of these other underground ones. Kick Tracy, No Rules. Such a good one here, 1991. Very cool album that came out on the RCA Records label. This was their debut studio album, produced by Dana Strum of Slaughter, which is why I'm sporting the Slaughter shirt here. And featuring vocalist Stephen Shareau. And I mention that because part of the reason why I think more recognition has been brought to this band over the years is who he is, because he was in the running to replace Vince Neil in Motley Crue back when he was out of the band. But of course, Motley Crue ended up going with John Corabi. It came down to those two guys, and they chose John Corabi. I think if they had chosen Stephen Shareau, it would have sounded more like the Vince Neil era, and they would have continued on. And I don't know that that album that they would have recorded with him would have been any better had they done it with Stephen Shareau. I think making the stylistic change both hurt and helped the band. It helped them because they weren't sticking to that glam metal sound, but at the same time it lost fans because it wasn't that. So, you know, it's a catch-22. But either way, they didn't go with Stephen Shareau. Now, the funny thing is, years later, he would audition for Velvet Revolver. It would be coming down to him, Sebastian Bach, and of course, they would ultimately go with the lead vocalist of Stone Temple Pilots. So, you know, he missed out, unfortunately, on two major bands that would have cemented his name in rock. But, you know, he got to do Kick Tracy, and he's actually still kicking around out there at this point. He's in a band right now currently called Zen from Mars. So you can still check him out there, and maybe one day he will get to front one of those major groups. But the cool thing about the Velvet Revolver thing is that there was a VH1 documentary being filmed at the time as part of that. It was just called The Project, where the three core guys from Guns N' Roses were attempting to find the vocalist. And ultimately, of course, we know what happened with that, but that was a kind of a cool thing, and so he appears on that and so forth. As far as this album is concerned, two big songs came off of it at the time that were all over radio and got a little bit of MTV play as well. Don't Need Rules, that one was everywhere, and then the other one, You're So Strange. Both of them very cool, very unique tracks. Band should have been more popular than they were. Came out in 1991. I think it was just a tale, you know, too late at the end of the whole thing to really catch on. Otherwise, they very well could have done what Slaughter did, meaning being a band that coming in at the tail end really took off right before the end. There was a few bands like that, Slaughter, Firehouse, stuff like that. Unfortunately, they just didn't quite make it at that point. They would put out an EP called Field Trip in 1992, but it was a very different direction for things. There's Stephen right there. Very different direction sounding for them, and unfortunately I think that killed this release and probably is why they didn't get picked up to do anything additional thereafter. But as I mentioned, Stephen Shareau is still kicking around out there, so you can go out and find him. But there you go, Glam Metal Gems number 8, those 5 releases. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. As I mentioned, this is number 8, so if you're really enjoying this series, there are 7 more before this. I do have a playlist on the channel. You can click on playlists and scroll down until you find the one that is called Glam Metal Gems to check them all out. And of course, I always leave in the description the link to the previous episode, so you can always stay up to date, and so you can always go backwards, watching them all that way, one at a time, clicking the links backwards if you choose. But as I said, there you go. Hopefully you enjoyed this. Leave your comments. Let me know your thoughts. Have a good one, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye, everyone.